Lovely to see everyone. So what I'm going to do today, guys, is I'm just going to take you through a little bit about a big volunteer recruitment that we did at the Zoological Society of London last year during the pandemic, which could be a bit contentious. So I just wanted to tell you what we did, what went well or didn't quite go so well, and what lessons we learned going forward. So now I'm going to attempt to share the screen. Here's to the first technical difficulty of 2021. Is that all sharing, Will? Can you double check for me?
Yeah, all good.
Perfect. All right. So as I say, I'm just going to take you through a little bit about recruiting in the pandemic. So there are a couple of slides that you will have seen before that I'm just going to take you through just to remind you as to who we are. So let me move on to the next page. I can't seem to, there we are. So this is who we are. So ZSL is an international conservation charity, and we have a rather grand vision of a world where wildlife thrives. But you probably know us more because we have two zoos, London Zoo and Whipsnade Zoo. And we've got lots of firsts and lots of oldest awards as part of ZSL, as you can see there. But more importantly, we've got over 20,000 animals as well. But more than that, we've also got groundbreaking conservation fieldwork happening across the globe in over 50 countries, and also a cutting edge science program as well. So ZSL is a little bit more than just the zoos. But just to put it in context, we have around 750 volunteers at the current time and around 600 staff. Sadly, we have just been through a bit of a restructure with some staff losses, so it might be a little bit less than that now. So again, you'll have seen this slide before, but I thought it was important for thinking about the recruitment I'm going to talk about more in a second. So when we reopened back in June, the government gave zoos and aquariums 5 days of notice to reopen. So it was quite short. So in order to bring back our current volunteers, we quickly pulled together a sort of a fact sheet to show them how we would be managing that and how we would be returning volunteers. So for us, it was a question of returning the volunteers in order of importance for the organisation and safety for them and the organisation as a whole. So organisational need, the volunteer roles, and then the individual circumstance of them and where they were in life as well. And for the higher risk volunteers, we undertook individual risk assessments before they returned. But the only role we really brought back to begin with was a stewarding role to ensure that the zoos were COVID safe back in June. Unlike museums and galleries, we don't routinely have staff on the ground undertaking kind of general visitor experience and security monitoring. We have specialist roles in that, but it meant that we needed a whole raft of people to sort of welcome, support people to understand how to visit under the new restrictions. So that was quite a different role to the one the volunteers had done previously. And again, you've seen these two things before if you've joined us. The redeployment fact sheet on the left was the same for all volunteers to really clearly outline that we were being open and transparent. And I think fair to everyone is a big thing that I'm keen on. And then on the right-hand side, we asked volunteers to self-declare whether they were in a low, medium or high risk group, depending on their personal circumstance and health position. We didn't ask them to necessarily declare their health conditions, but we asked them to group themselves and we dealt with them accordingly to that. So we took quite a low risk approach to bringing volunteers back. At that time, we brought the low risk back first and then moved up the risk categories. And now any volunteer in any of those risk groups, when we're not in lockdown, could be back volunteering with us with additional adjustments. So why did we recruit then? So we started recruiting towards the end of June 2020. So only sort of a few weeks into reopening after that first lockdown, which might seem rather unusual to start recruiting at that time. But the reason we did, as outlined on the screen, is that we were unable to meet the zoo demands. So what we needed, we made our zoos one way. We had only certain exhibits open, some were closed. We asked people to visit in a different way. And actually that was quite baffling for visitors coming back from after a 3-month break, but also we spotted a lot of new visitors to us as well, who'd never visited before. So for us, it was quite critical to ensure that that visitor experience was really supportive and positive. So we really wanted to have ZSL representatives visible on site to help visitors to understand how to get the most out of their visit to the zoos. But it meant we didn't have enough volunteers, sadly. The reason for that was that our supportive process to return the volunteers was quite slow, you know, being really honest and upfront. So it meant that actually we didn't necessarily have all the volunteers ready to go when we needed them to. But also we were very committed to supporting volunteers to come back when they felt ready to, in a phased way, when they were happy that things were sort of set up as they'd like. So not everyone was ready to come back in June anyway. And then lastly, the new operating systems, new one-way systems around the zoo required more numbers than even if every volunteer had wanted to come back in June that we had available. So we knew we had to do some recruitment. The other big reason for us was that you may have seen it, but ZSL had done quite a prominent fundraising campaign with David Attenborough leading it to raise the profile and the sort of plight of ZSL at this time, but also to seek fundraising. So for us, it was quite an easy way to piggyback off the back of that and to put it as a sort of an alternative way to give by, if you're not able to or don't feel comfortable giving money, and not everyone is by any stretch of the imagination, and another way that you could give is by volunteering with us. And that went down really, really well, as you'll see in a minute. But it was also a really good opportunity to diversify the volunteer team, because what we knew after lockdown 1 was there were a lot of people who previously would have been in employment or doing other things, were now available and looking to give back and support, and actually really wanted to support the sort of job market as well, and actually support people to develop and continue gaining new skills when perhaps employment was a bit of a trickier prospect at that time. So hopefully a bit win-win. How was it received by volunteers? So we wrote to all the volunteers in advance of the campaign, outlining that we were recruiting, why we were recruiting, asking for their support to recruit, because obviously we know that your existing teams, your existing workforce are really, really vital to ensure that something is positively received, but also providing reassurance to them that this wasn't a displacement exercise to get rid of them. So you can see some of the wording there in the speech bubbles. So, you know, this in no way is about displacing the current team, but rather about complementing your enthusiasm, experience, whilst ensuring that we also don't exert your will. Oh, I can hear someone in the background, just ensure you guys are muted for a sec. So it was about reassuring them as well, but you know, inevitably we did have mixed feedback from our visitor-facing volunteers. You know, we did have complaints, we did have concerns that it was a bit of the out with the old and in with the new. You know, why are they recruiting when I'm not back yet? I don't feel ready to be back, but will there be a place for me in the future if they're recruiting loads of new people? So all understandable completely. But on the other side, we had people who were nonplussed by it, were happy. You know, it's just part of what the zoo needs to do to keep themselves going. And we had some very positive reactions, and some people were very keen to support and acted as case studies for us as well. So how did we recruit? Because it was a common cause to open the zoo safely and positively, it did mean that we were able to do a cross-ZSL approach. So marketing, PR, digital, HR and learning were all involved in this. Now, I would say that this is the first time this has happened for me at ZSL. So it really was a galvanizing of everyone working together, which is brilliant. We had a huge PR campaign. Because it was off the back of the Attenborough campaign, we had to make sure that it sort of looked similar and that it had a similar aplomb. We had a light touch registration form. So it simply asked, you know, very minor personal details, what their preferences were around availability and site that they'd volunteer at, and a couple of health and safety questions just to check that they weren't in high risk categories at that time. Then they were all offered, so everyone was offered the chance to attend a face-to-face, socially distanced taster session. Now, everyone was offered the chance, but not everyone was able to attend one, and I'll explain why in a second. But everyone was offered that chance, and they were asked to sign up to attend a date, and it was a little bit of fastest finger first, I grant you. We then, in the taster sessions, we did a bit of intros. We asked them to look around the site. We asked them to go and speak to current members of the team about what it was like to volunteer on site. And then we did some socially distanced group tasks and had a Q&A. So it's quite short, quite quick, but we had loads of members of our visitor-facing team involved, so that we had lots of eyes and ears on the ground, kind of observing our candidates to see who might be a good fit for the zoo. We then asked, as part of the process, we had to get a bit more information from them, obviously, and took up references as per our safeguarding policy. We then sent out information packs by email, and they had a face-to-face induction with staff. Now, this did change a little bit as time went on. We did start doing it as one-to-ones or small groups, but then as the momentum of the campaign grew, we had to do it as larger groups, again, that could socially distance. And then volunteers were encouraged to come and then shadow existing members of the team until they felt comfortable with the day-to-day routine of volunteering. And the chap that you can see on the screen there, David, was one of our new volunteers that came in as part of the campaign, who then, he came in to the campaign. He was one of our models for our campaign. This is some of the areas that you can see where our PR reached. I was absolutely overwhelmed, to be honest, with how successful the PR campaign had been. To see our volunteers and our drive featured in Marie Claire and Stylist and places like that was off the charts for anything I'd experienced before. But we also used social media. We got spots on the news. And I think partially because we were able to twin our recruitment campaign with a general support the zoo's message, it meant it gained more traction than it might otherwise. So I think it was very fortuitous, the timing. I don't think if we did this again, we'd probably get quite such an amazing reach. But in terms of the outcome, it was really, really positive. We had over 2,500 people apply. Now, that is bonkers for us. For a typical recruitment, perhaps for London Zoo, for a visitor-facing role, prior to this campaign, we might have had maybe 20 to 40 people apply, and this was 2,500. That was off the charts for us. And in fact, it was actually more than we wanted, ironically. So we managed to treble our visitor-facing volunteer numbers. And in London Zoo, you can see the vast majority of our current team now are new. We have got a lot of people waiting in the wings, but they still don't feel comfortable returning just yet. And then in Whipsnade, it's about half and half existing volunteers and new. But we also now have the benefit of a huge waiting list of people for future opportunities off the back of that. You see my positive spin on that. But in terms of sort of reflection, so it's quite hard to have lessons learned about this, because the collision of the different factors, hopefully we won't find ourselves in a time like this again. Hope for at least a couple of decades at least. It's quite hard to think about how you'd apply some of these lessons learnt for a future situation, but there is always something you can learn. It was anecdotally told to us many, many times that the light touch recruitment process was very much appreciated and easy for people. It was very easy to complete. It could be done in a matter of moments. What we learned was you need to get the background infrastructure right. So we don't currently have any volunteer management software, believe it or not, for such a large institution. So it was all very manual and very time consuming. And we had low numbers of staff right at the beginning as well, because a lot of our staff were still on furlough. So for me, I think if I was able to backtrack, I'd make sure that I had thought properly about that before embarking on this, but I was kind of being shoved by our senior team at the same time. So not that easy to manage. The power of PR is huge, as you can see, but what the challenge we had was the interest vastly outweighed the demand. So sadly, it did leave some people disappointed. So it's about sort of ensuring that your activity is proportional to the scale of need. Now, for us, it was very difficult to know this because we had absolutely no idea what the uptake would be like, or from both the press partners, but also from members of the public to volunteer. So there was no benchmark on which to sort of start. So that was quite hard to think about. But for us going forward, we now have a way of thinking about it. But also as the campaign gained momentum, the backlog of administration grew and turnaround slowed. So again, in retrospect, thinking about how to readjust and recommunicate expectations, both internally to the organisation, to ourselves. I was working all hours at one point to try and keep ourselves on track. And actually, I should have been honest with myself a little bit and a bit more realistic about it. But also externally to those candidates to say, actually, it's going to take a little while longer once momentum has reached. But also the short turnaround and the quick kind of having to sort of set this going, and the scale of the recruitment that we were managing meant that evaluation and monitoring weren't built in. So it's quite hard now reflecting on it because it was all guns blazing, get on and do it, without sort of perhaps properly planning it like you would normally do in a situation. So those are all sort of things I would ideally have done, but time was so crucial in this that I think I could be forgiven for not putting them in there. But that's a very quick whistle-stop tour through the recruitment. I'm very happy to take any questions, but hopefully that was interesting at least to have a little read of. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Brilliant, thank you, Rihanna. It was subtle, but it was amazing to see how many volunteers you recruited in such a short time frame, and the power of volunteering and the ability when working alongside different departments to really make an impact, both visually but also on the message you're getting out about the need to support cultural organisations like ZSL. I've got time for one question before we head over to Matt, and we can pick up some of your questions later. A lot of people are saying it's an amazing achievement. They're all interested in the light touch recruitment form. Firstly, how short is it? And in hindsight, was there anything you'd add back on?
Really good question. Sadly, as one always does, hindsight is this wonderful thing. I forgot to take a screenshot of it. So this was a form that was embedded into the website. So they didn't need to download anything. They didn't need to take anything off. They went onto the page. That page, the URL was then able to be linked into all our campaign materials. So it was really easy to find. It was literally name, contact details, so an email and a phone number. We asked people to give us a date of birth purely so that we could check they were over the age of 18, because that's our threshold for volunteering. What venue, so Whipsnade and London Zoo. What their availability was. So we gave them a drop-down menu, 4 different options. And again, it was any preference. We weren't going to hold them to it. And then the last 4 questions, which led on from one another, were around health and safety. So are you being asked to shield at the moment? Because bearing in mind, this was right at the beginning of the pandemic, where those that were in the higher risk categories were really still shielding at this time and not encouraged to volunteer. So we were obviously having to toe the party line with that. So asking if they were close by to the zoos, so they didn't have to travel too far and get public transport. Were they shielding and or high risk? And did they have any additional needs or disabilities that we should be aware of so that they could volunteer safely with us? And again, that's not one that would have limited them from being involved. It was just so that we knew in advance of them attending. They pressed submit on the website and it came straight through to us as a web form. So for them, it was super easy. Wasn't super easy for us, because that generated an email for every one of those that then needed to be uploaded. So that's what I'm saying. Without the integrated volunteer management system that we don't have in place right now, it was lovely and light touch for our applicants, which is really what I wanted, but it was a beast for us, and unfortunately. Anything I would add? Sorry, anything I would add? Yes, the one thing when I was writing this up, in fact, and I oohed and ahed about whether to add it in at the time, would have been, how did you find out about this opportunity? We talk about it a lot, but because that web form was being produced at the rate of knots, and I didn't want the web form to be too long, I didn't want to put that in as an extra question, but in hindsight, that was an error on my part. So yeah, definitely that. you.